everyone, welcome to another episode of Unauthorized Disclosure. We're doing a video podcast this week, and I'm really excited because we're joined by one of my favorite people who's also a good friend, an awesome journalist, Anya Parampil. She's host of the show Red Lines for the Grayzone. So Anya, I'm so happy to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
It's good to be with you guys virtually.
So, yeah, right. So there's a lot we want to talk about with you with regard to Venezuela this week. There's been some insane stuff happening the last 2 weeks or so in Venezuela, which is kind of like your beat. There was this attempted coup by a mercenary group that has connections to like a U.S. mercenary group. So for those who aren't really familiar with the details, can you give us like an overall or like a summary of what happened with this coup a few weeks ago?
Sure. The news about the coup and the name Jordan Goudreau first surfaced officially in U.S. media on May 1st, when the Associated Press released an article alleging that this former Green Beret, Jordan Goudreau, the CEO of a company called Silvercorp USA, a private mercenary firm, had been contracted by Juan Guaido, the previously unknown Venezuelan opposition figure, which the United States recognized as president of the whole country last year, had actually written a contract and signed a contract with Goudreau for an operation that would result in the kidnapping of Venezuela's elected president, the president who also happens to control all of the borders, all of the government ministries, and the military, Nicolas Maduro. This report came just a few weeks after the United States actually announced that it was offering a reward for the capture of President Maduro. The U.S. State Department announced that it was going to give I believe, $15 million prize to anyone who could provide information leading to the arrest of President Maduro. And it was just seen by many of us as a hit, a bounty, a mob-style price put on the head of the president of a foreign country, a very odd move by the United States, something that's, as far as I'm aware, without precedent. And Goudreau, at the time when this article was published, it was a Friday, again, May 1st, he didn't comment or verify the story. He didn't want to actually go on the record and say that this contract existed. But that all changed on Sunday, May 3rd, when news broke that Venezuela had actually captured or killed, in this instance, actually killed 8 mercenaries, what they described as terrorists coming in from Colombia. They were trying to invade Venezuela on speedboats, and 8 mercenaries were killed. This was Sunday morning, May 3rd. And that evening, Jordan Goudreau decided to go public and actually gave an interview to Miami-based media, opposition media, in order to really complain about the behavior he experienced with the Venezuelan opposition. He said that Juan Guaido and his partners in the deal had not held up their end of the bargain. Essentially, they hadn't paid him. It was a $212 million contract. And that, as far as he was concerned, the opposition figures he was working with had no regard for men, his troops that he'd assembled in Colombia, and who he was directing to carry out this invasion. And so he goes public. He actually releases parts of the contract with Juan Guaido's signature. He also releases a video recording, which is really only audio because it's of the ceiling, but you can hear a conversation between Jordan Goudreau and who he says is Juan Guaido, during which they sign the contract. And that same evening, Jordan Goudreau tweets at President Donald Trump this very odd message: strike force incursion into Venezuela, including 2 U.S. Green Berets and about 60 Venezuelan military defectors. And sure enough, the next day, those 2 U.S. citizens and the Venezuelan military defectors they were working with attempted to invade Venezuela and were arrested by the Venezuelan military. They were initially rounded up by an armed contingency of fishermen who turned them into Venezuelan authorities. And now 2 U.S. citizens, Aaron Berry and Luke Denman, are in Venezuelan custody and have confessed to participating in this plot, even though in the video that was released of their interrogation, they didn't look to be harmed. And even the Washington Post said that in the video they looked calm and unharmed. So it didn't take much for them to admit to this plan, and it had already been exposed in the Associated Press 2 days before it went ahead.
It's pretty shocking because it's like, okay, so there's possibly a link between the U.S. government and this group. The U.S. government's denying it. But like you mentioned, even if the U.S. government didn't have anything to do with it, and it really was between just the Venezuelan opposition and this U.S. mercenary group, the U.S. government still put a bounty on Maduro's head. So they're still responsible in a big way for anybody who's acting on that. I mean, there's a $15 million bounty. The mercenary group was trying to make some money.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, the United States was encouraging this very action, or this type of action, when it released a bounty and put that ridiculous sum on the head of a president of a foreign country. It's absolutely outrageous. But I also find it very difficult to believe that these U.S. citizens were running a military operation out of Colombia, shipping in weapons of war, serious weaponry, and maintaining a training camp in the country without any knowledge of U.S. embassy staff in Bogota. That just doesn't really make sense to me. And I should add that the diplomats who used to work in Venezuela, the U.S. diplomats who worked in Caracas, were dismissed last year following the initiation of this coup. After the recognition of Guaido, Venezuelan government dismissed the U.S. charge d'affaires, James Story, and other U.S. diplomatic staff once it became obvious the U.S. was running a coup against the country. And since then, those diplomats have been working out of the Colombian embassy in Bogota, what the U.S. describes as a virtual embassy. So the whole purpose of that diplomatic crew, or their mission in recent years, has been to destabilize the Venezuelan government, and now they're running that operation out of Colombia. I just would really love to ask Jordan Goudreau whether or not James Story was in on any of those planning meetings. And actually, just 2 days before the Associated Press published this report exposing Goudreau's what would become his failed invasion, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told reporters in Washington that he'd instructed his staff to update plans to reopen the Venezuelan embassy in Caracas, or the U.S. embassy in Venezuela, I should say. And so for some reason, he was confident that there was going to be some sort of development and change in Venezuela, which would lead to U.S. diplomatic staff returning to the country. It was a little suspicious to me that he made those comments just days before Jordan Goudreau launched this insane operation.
Well, I think we can at least say that if they weren't participants, they were allowing it to happen. Because if I recall in the Associated Press story, they talk about how the Colombian intelligence directorate knows of these meetings. There's a retired major general in the Venezuela army who was described as the ringleader of the Venezuelan military deserters. His name's Cliver Alcala, who maintained 3 camps with dozens of men in and around a desert-like peninsula that Colombia shares with Venezuela. And so they were aware that these were happening. And also this man, Cliver, he had big talk about what this was going to be, this kind of incursion that was planned. And so the CIA was tipped off. Like, they knew, because the Colombian intelligence was checking in with people in U.S. intelligence about these plans. So I think we can say that the U.S. intelligence agencies were well aware, and maybe we're thinking, let's see if this fails or succeeds, because it could provide us an opportunity if it does come to fruition and work out. But I want to ask you about Silvercorp. How would you describe to people listening this company? To me, it's kind of like a dollar store version of Blackwater.
Yeah.
And I can't help but when I look at the way it operated, when I think about the individual, this Jordan Goudreau, that it's kind of a cross between Blackwater and Stratfor, this private intelligence firm that was boisterous and claimed to be able to gather so much information and have so many links to governments, and yet it just really wasn't ever as it billed itself.
Yeah, there are obvious similarities between Jordan Goudreau, Silvercorp, and Blackwater. I personally think that Jordan Goudreau wanted to make himself into the next kind of Eric Prince by running this successful operation and showing the president what he could do, how he could remove and kidnap the president of Venezuela and bring him to the United States to face charges. Total delusions of grandeur. But this company actually began, it's very bizarre. It started, and I've gone back and watched their early promotional videos. They started as a company that planned to employ soldiers who return to the United States after serving abroad as security trainers and consultants in schools, and ultimately provide security in schools. So you have these ex-Green Berets coming back, and their idea was to start putting them in schools to prevent active shooter situations. There's all these very odd Instagram posts with Jordan Goudreau where he puts the hashtag active shooter training, because that's how this company began. That was their original business plan. And then, according to a conversation that I actually had with his business partner, Jordan Goudreau's business partner, the COO of Silvercorp, a man by the name of Drew White, he says that Jordan started spending more time in Central and South America. He was doing jobs in Costa Rica, I believe, and through that got this contract to provide security at Richard Branson's Venezuela Live Aid concert, which they held on the border with Colombia last year on February 23rd, the date the United States actually attempted to invade Venezuela under the guise of that humanitarian aid delivery. You might remember it all ended up in flames, and later the New York Times confirmed our reporting at the Grayzone, which from day one spelled out exactly how it was U.S. people on the Colombian side on the U.S. side who burned that aid, even though they tried to blame it on the Venezuelan military. But Jordan Goudreau was at that event. He was providing security for it. And that's where he apparently got hooked up with the Venezuelan opposition. And I'm so glad you brought up Major General Cliver Alcala, because his case is actually super interesting, and his role in all of this is really interesting and kind of raises more questions about the level of U.S. involvement here, because in that AP article, it says that Alcala was already, as you said, organizing Venezuelan military defectors to do some sort of invasion or operation against the Venezuelan state. He was already doing that when he linked up with Goudreau, and then they decided to do it together. So I have a feeling if Cliver Alcala he's defected from the Venezuelan government since 2015. He's a high-level collaborator of the United States. I just don't believe that the U.S. didn't know that this is something he was doing. But even more bizarre or more questionable than just that reality, that he was already running this operation, that he definitely is meeting with U.S. officials and Colombian officials in Colombia regularly. On the day that the United States indicted Nicolas Maduro with these drug trafficking charges, Alcala actually released a video on his Twitter account. This was March 26th, saying that he was part of an operation to kidnap or kill the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and that that this plot had been hatched and contracted through Juan Guaido, that Juan Guaido had actually put this whole operation together, and he didn't offer any other details at the time. But now that the AP report has come out and named Alcalá and spoke with him at length, it's become clear that this is the operation he was referring to on March 26th. But it just so happens that the U.S. also indicted Cliver Alcalá on that same day in the same case that it's bringing against President Maduro. And so after Alcalá revealed the elements of this assassination plot, he actually turned himself into U.S. officials in Colombia, is now in New York in U.S. custody. But his arrest was so friendly that even the Colombian Attorney General released a communique complaining that proper procedure hadn't been followed during his arrest. When they detained him, it was so friendly, he wasn't even handcuffed. So what the United States was actually doing there, it looks like, was giving him a safe exit from Colombia in the midst of all of this, because he was one of the US's highest level collaborators. And so this is how we have to also just make the point that it's impossible the United States didn't know about this, because this Colombian general, who, as the AP described, was the ringleader of this plot, has been in US custody since March. And he actually spoke with the AP and was the primary source in this story while in US custody. So how would that happen without the knowledge of US officials?
You know, there does seem to be an attempt to spin this narrative by some U.S. officials, and then also, like, I saw at least one article in Bloomberg trying to work with this narrative of, like, these guys were a joke. You know, they were caught so quickly. The U.S., if they were going to do an operation, would have done one that worked and that was better and more successful. And even Trump said this, and so he did an interview with Fox News where he essentially said, if we did it, you'd be seeing the U.S. military invading Venezuela. You know, we wouldn't be leaving it to a bunch of clowns. So what do you make of that? Like, is that an attempt to like an attempt to try and distance the U.S. from this?
Absolutely. I think when I read the AP article in the very beginning, and I got the sense that it was spinning it to make it seem as though this lone, crazy ex-Green Beret had come up with this plan and went out and did it all on his own, and they made a major point to say U.S. officials didn't know. But it seemed as though they were trying to actually cover for the fact that U.S. officials would have had to have been involved if he made it this far. Again, running military training camps, shipping weapons into Colombia, and just having that sort of presence in the country. It doesn't add up that there would be no knowledge. And we know, as Kevin mentioned, that the CIA was even warning them. There was actually a report that the CIA encountered some of these mercenaries in Jamaica when I think the U.S. citizens that were traveling there, and warned them not to participate in it. So they had more of an ability to actually stop it if they wanted to, but obviously they didn't. And something else that came out of my interview with Drew White is that he said that when Jordan initially approached him with this idea and this plan, he was claiming to have a State Department contract. So I don't think he would have been running around telling his best friend and business partner that it was a State Department sanctioned operation without somebody from the State Department or someone from the U.S. government giving him some sort of confidence and idea that he was getting that level of contract. The friend and the CEO, Drew White, said that the contract didn't appear to be legitimate, so he was uncomfortable with it and actually broke with Jordan over this insane batshit plot. But I think it's worth asking why Jordan was under that impression. And it's probably true that the United States, if they were going to be serious about this, could go ahead with its own military. But the United States knows, based on what happened last year in February, or last year on April 30th, when Juan Guaido led that failed uprising of 30 people, that the Venezuelan military is far more unified than they could have ever predicted. And it's possible that they were just using this as a test balloon, kind of as Kevin insinuated that they could send out this group of guys who definitely were crazy. I mean, they were prepared. They had their passports. They really believed, I think, that they were going to be welcomed as saviors the minute they ran into this country. They're probably watching too much Jack Ryan or something like that. But based on the results of the operation, the United States now must have a better idea that the Venezuelan military is way more unified than they thought. And so at the same time, I don't buy this whole argument that they would do it more effectively, because over the past year and a half, every policy decision they've made with regard to Venezuela is just so stupid.
Yeah.
Recognizing Juan Guaido to that failed military uprising in April of last year, all of that was just so ridiculous to anybody who has any knowledge of Venezuela, that I just wouldn't put it past them to let these fools kind of act on their behalf and make a disturbance, and perhaps even spark something greater that could have been their hope as well.
Also, it does seem like an attempt to also downplay, like what you mentioned, how unified the Venezuelan military is. And I mean, I think it's really interesting that these fishermen are the ones who outed these guys, and initially had detained them and told the Venezuelan government about them. And it shows you that there isn't this mass feeling of revolt across the country like we're told. So it definitely seems like a way to also suggest oh yeah, these are just a bunch of clowns, that's why it didn't work, as opposed to, no, Venezuela is a functioning state that has people who support it and will defend it.
And initially, Jordan Goudreau was complaining that they've been so heavily infiltrated by what he said to be Cuban and Venezuelan agents. But it actually is true that Venezuela's security services did infiltrate this plot at the highest level. They even say so. Diosdado Cabello, the president of Venezuela's National Constituent Assembly, who is kind of the spiritual leader of the country, he has a weekly show called Con El Mazo Dando that all the Chavistas watch. Everybody looks forward to every week. He talks for 2 hours with this giant board behind him where he pulls out all the interesting tweets and headlines of the week. He said during one of his programs that we'd infiltrated them so heavily that we knew what they were eating, and that sometimes we paid for their meetings, because they had no operational security either, based on reports from some other U.S. ex-military people who actually said they visited the camps and said that people were coming and going as they pleased, that they didn't have any food. They were starving, basically. So it was just a disaster. And the Venezuelans knew they were coming.
So let's talk about this contract that has been revealed, because there are two aspects that I'd like you to speak to. One is the fact that you have two advisors, people who were from Guaido's team, who signed on the contract. And then I understand that in the here, we've seen that they resigned their position. It was only us, and it was our mistake, and it's not Juan Guaido who was involved. It was just us, and this was our choice. But I remember seeing that Juan Guaido and his people said something to the effect of, if they could get 800 or more people, I believe, they were willing to take this more seriously. But it seems like they started to doubt that Goudreau could mobilize the numbers that he was promising. But I also want to raise a couple details in the contract that caught my attention. For one, there's a $10 million success bonus. I'm wondering what you think about that. But also, it's amazing because when you think of the aftermath of coups, it contemplated using Silvercorp as this mercenary force that would be used within Venezuela to secure Venezuela after, to make it so that the right-wing opposition could instill and institute law and order, or oppressive law and order against the people of Venezuela, to put down any kind of rebellion against these people who would decide to staged this coup against Nicolas Maduro. And so you would have had Americans within Silvercorp USA, or you would have had this American private mercenary firm, the brainchild of a Green Beret there, helping this Latin American country have this succeeded. And they were planning to go around to raid civilian homes, to engage in riot control. They go so far to contemplate rules of engagement. It also caught my attention that there was this line in the contract that read, this rules of engagement does not limit the use of force, including deadly force, in self-defense to an imminent threat of death or serious injury. So they were really contemplating a way that they could use force against the people of Venezuela and get away with it.
Pretty disturbing, right? I mean, at the end of my conversation with Drew White, the Silvercorp CEO, he said, and he kind of laughed, even though he was pretty upset because now his friends are in Venezuelan custody. He was like, man, I just wish these guys would have stuck to doing the school security thing because they wouldn't be locked up down there now. And it's just, yeah, it's outrageous that they were thinking of themselves as one day having the possibility of exercising that level of power, wielding that level of authority in Venezuela. But on the question of the contract, it's very interesting because Jordan Goudreau was effectively silenced last Monday. That's the last time that he ever, I guess that's May 4th, the last time he ever spoke with media. He spoke with Bloomberg. He gave an interview to Bloomberg, and he spoke with me. We had a short 2-minute conversation on Monday, and he said that he wanted to have a conversation longer on Tuesday because he really wanted to spill the beans on the Venezuelan opposition, these really just nasty, corrupt individuals who I don't doubt did screw him over in some way. And I wanted to get the details on that because I have covered a lot of those opposition figures so closely, and I'm just really familiar with their really nasty, corrupt behavior. And he never called me back. He never spoke with any other media outlet. And I think it's because the United States has now said it's opened a case into Jordan Goudreau for arms trafficking and violating US law, I think, in order to shut him up and make sure that he didn't actually divulge any more details or elements to the story. That was after he released the contract. In his version that he released, Juan Guaido's signature is on the document. Juan Guaido now claims that he never knew Jordan Goudreau and asserts that that signature was forged. But since Goudreau was silenced, and I should say, in the last interview he made, he admitted something very significant, I think, without knowing it. When he was speaking with Bloomberg, he said, you know, these guys have all the Citgo money and access to all these US accounts, and they weren't able to pay me. What's up with that? And the thing is, the Venezuelan opposition has been denying that they have their ability to access that money, that they actually have their hands in the pot, particularly when it comes to Citgo, the largest, Venezuela's largest international asset, which is a subsidiary of its state oil company. We know it as a gas station here, but it is an arm of, it used to belong to the Venezuelan government. Now its accounts have been frozen, controlled by the United States, and myself and other journalists and people who have covered this issue closely have asserted that the opposition figures do have control over these accounts, that they are obviously paying themselves somehow, and they didn't ever, they always denied that they had access to the money. And Jordan Goudreau was obviously told something different by those opposition figures. He was promised big bucks. And so he accidentally let it slide that they were speaking openly about having access to these accounts. And since then he was shut up. And then this story emerges in the Washington Post about how Juan Guaido's political advisors, J.J. Rendon and Sergio Vergara, that they were the only ones who signed the contract, and that one of them even claims he was the only one who gave Jordan any money, and that he gave him 50 grand as sort of a retainer fee or a sum to keep his confidence that he would eventually get paid, and that the rest of the $212 million contract was going to be paid through future oil contracts that Goudreau would receive to protect oil in Venezuela after Juan Guaido took over. I just don't believe that somebody like Jordan Goudreau or anyone would go ahead with such a risky operation, having only been paid 50 grand and being promised the rest somewhere down the line. It just seemed as though that article and that story was put out to not only cover Juan Guaido, but to cover for the fact that they were admitting to have their hands in Venezuela's stolen wealth. They want us to just believe that some rich Venezuelan opposition figure in Miami gave him 50 grand and that was enough. I don't buy it. They obviously just were getting a little bit concerned that Goudreau was saying too much about the thievery that's really taken place in the United States and around the world since the U.S. and its allies recognized Guaido last year.
Speaking of Guaido, like, how is he not arrested? It's funny to me because we're always told that Maduro is like a tyrant and he's a dictator and he's so brutal, but like Guaido walks around totally free to collaborate with a foreign power in an attempt to overthrow the same government all the time. Like he's still walking around free, right?
Crazy, yeah. I remember being in Venezuela last February, right around the time of the first failed invasion, and Guaido, toward the end of my trip there, actually left. Or no, he went to Colombia, right, for the event, for the Branson concert. That's probably where he met Jordan Goudreau. And at that point, it's since come out that he was smuggled across the border by a notoriously violent drug cartel in Colombia. So at the time, we were all wondering how he made it out of the country anyway, but now we know the answer. But the question for all of us still inside Venezuela was, are they going to let him back in? And it was shocking then to see him. I believe he landed in the Caracas airport and walked out. He walked out victoriously that time with his flag, and he was welcomed back by his supporters, which have since dwindled in numbers because he's just proven himself to be nothing but a failure. But he wasn't arrested then after he went to Colombia and participated in attempted invasion. And then there was April 30th when he actually gathered military defectors and tried to storm a military base in the middle of Caracas. I mean, there's no way you could do something like that in any other country and not be arrested then. And now this. I think from the Venezuelan government's point of view, arresting him would give him more legitimacy than he even has now on the streets. He's not this glorious opposition figure who's even really a threat to them. It's kind of just this weird virtual reality that the United States has created around Guaido that makes him, that even would lead to any of us thinking he's a remarkable figure at all. But even look still, every time he releases a video, he's in a basement less put together than my set. It like looks seriously just grungy with like a little flag in the back. Kind of, he sometimes looks like a hostage. It's very bizarre, but that's what he is. And so we just don't care.
He always looks coked up. Like his eyes are always like bloodshot, and he like looks like he just took just did a line of coke.
Yeah, I remember during the February attempted invasion when Marco Rubio was in Colombia and he was tweeting all night. He was tweeting out like every hour. He was tweeting out Manuel Noriega, pictures of him getting killed. Gaddafi, that's when he tweeted the Gaddafi picture. So we were all just sitting in Venezuela joking, cocaine is a hell of a drug, man. These guys are all in Colombia, obviously partying. And actually, some of the Venezuelan opposition figures who went over there ended up getting busted for drugs and prostitutes. So,
right, I forgot about that. It's pretty incredible. This is just like a failed strategy that's been going on for 2 years. Has it been 2 years, like a year and a half?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be like, under Elliot Abrams, this has all just been a massive failure. But in the process, even if the U.S. isn't winning, like, they're still imposing these really brutal sanctions on Venezuela that have, according to CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, led to about 40,000 deaths a year because of lack of medicine getting into the country because of the sanctions. So in the meantime, like, you have a lot of people on the ground that you talk to in Venezuela. How is Venezuela dealing with coronavirus? Because everybody
Really?
bad, and it feels like the government has a control over it for now.
Yes, in Venezuela, there are very strict stay-at-home measures in place. And I don't have the most recent number of confirmed cases, but it's nowhere near anywhere as close as what we've experienced here or in other comparable countries in the region. In fact, Venezuela actually has the highest testing rate in all of Latin America, according to the most recent numbers that I've seen from the Organization of American States. And it's really fascinating, actually, because in some ways, the COVID-19 experience has strengthened Venezuela. It was in a better place to address it than a lot of U.S. allies in the region because it has such strong relations with countries such as China and Russia that it's been importing hundreds of tons every week of supplies of testing kits and masks from China and Russia. I think this week, Venezuela said, as of this week, China has sent 157 tons worth of equipment to Venezuela. And mass testing is really the key, as we know, in all of these countries that have had success in curbing the outbreak. If you're able to do that, you have a better chance at restricting the disease, defeating it. And Venezuela's economy was basically already shut down or strangled in a way that when these measures were put in place, they were actually able to effectively enforce them. Whereas other countries in the region, people are going to have to choose between working and dying. If they can't go and participate in the informal economy, they might not have any food to eat. And so other countries have been more hesitant to put lockdown orders in place. And they also don't have the ability to import medical supplies from China and Russia, because if you're a U.S. puppet state, you're not really allowed to do that. And the United States can't even get medical equipment to its own states in the U.S. So its puppet states are just kind of screwed on this one. And so in Bolivia, in Ecuador I think has been the most heartening example. In Guayaquil, you're actually seeing bodies left in the street piling up because they're just not being taken care of, and people have to wait weeks before they can even get an appointment with the doctor. And because that is what happens when you implement austerity and open your country up to the IMF and you liberalize, your healthcare systems truly suffer. So Venezuela's healthcare system definitely has been hit and decimated as a result of U.S. sanctions on a very large scale. But when it came to the COVID outbreak specifically, because getting something like testing kits from China really makes a difference. And also, when you have a country, if you've been to Venezuela, you'll immediately recognize that there's just a different mentality in a country that's actually going through a revolutionary process, where people have this idea of collective responsibility and getting through the crisis together and actually being responsible for your neighbor and your fellow citizens, which is just the total opposite of what we have in the United States and in neoliberal capitalist economies, where people get this every man for themselves mentality. And oh, by the way, you better not tell me to put on a mask and not go to work because I'm free kind of situation. So in some ways, Venezuela was actually better equipped than countries in the region to respond to the crisis. And if anything, its numbers tell the story. I don't think Venezuela would be able to hide deaths piling up in the street if it was happening the way it is is in Ecuador right now. And so it should just tell people in the region, if you have a country that actually structures its system and its government off the needs of its people, that might be the most viable system. That might actually mean that people aren't dying when there's a major health crisis.
So it's been clear from the beginning that they wanted to exploit the coronavirus crisis, they being the Trump administration and then the right-wing opposition, to use it in the way that we've seen disaster capitalism play out around the world. And I'm thinking, as we begin to wrap here, why don't you give a kind of final assessment on how you would grade these cowboy neoconservatives and their efforts thus far in exploiting the crisis? I mean, obviously, one of the ways they did immediately try to seize upon the vacuum that existed as everyone was focused on the pandemic is to pass down these narco trafficking charges that were totally bogus. But I would also add as we wrap, that we've seen with the media that there are a number of times that assassination attempts are carried out. There are a number of instances we can point to in the last 2 to 3 years. We don't have to stop our timeline there, though. We can go back 5, 10, 20 years and see the sheer volume of feeble-minded efforts that have been attempted, and then some that were also potentially dangerous had they succeeded, like the 2018 drone attack on Nicolas Maduro that didn't quite go as planned, but they got close to him. They got really close to him. And I understand that someone involved in that was actually in one of the camps that was planning to participate in the invasion.
Yeah, these figures are constantly popping up there have just been endless coup attempts and military attempts to destabilize Venezuela. I didn't even know until I went there and got more acquainted with the history. There's just one attempt after another of some rich guy organizing a bunch of mercenaries on his farm, to organizing in Colombia, and all of these figures, they either get out of the country and then come here and start organizing. Now a lot of them are working in Guaido's opposition shadow government here in the US. And so they've been running and failing since the start of the Bolivarian Revolution, since Chavez was elected in 98. They've been trying to undermine the country, or try to undermine the rule of Chavismo, and it always fails. And there was this actually on the question of the neocon side, there was just a really great piece in the American Conservative, actually based on conversations with high-level State Department officials and former officials who say that they actually referred to Elliot Abrams within State Department as the zombie neocon, and that he's been so manipulative in his dealings with President Trump that he sometimes doesn't present him with the full array of options when discussing policy. Sometimes he'll only present one or two options because he wants the most extreme option to be selected, and he doesn't want anybody to have to think that another way is possible. And this operation just really felt like an Elliot Abrams style operation, right? The shadiness, the covert destabilization attempts, the terror campaign, that's Elliot Abrams 101. And I just think that, especially now that 2 US citizens are in Venezuelan custody, it could present the moment for direct engagement with the Venezuelan government. I believe the Venezuelan government would like to return those 2 US citizens, but that they're going to want something in return. And I don't know if this administration is up for that type of dialogue. The one other point that I'll make on the you mentioned the DEA, the State Department reward for the capture or kill of President Maduro, and the fact that the DEA sent those anti-narcotic ships to the region. Well, it was partially sabotaged because of coronavirus. There was a huge outbreak of coronavirus among the sailors on that ship that they sent, that they were sending to go posture against Venezuela. But that there is still a fear, I think, among many of us, that there are people who would like to use this and the fact that there are two U.S. citizens now in Venezuelan custody to escalate the situation. And we shouldn't forget the case of the Panama invasion, when the United States invaded Panama in 1989 and kidnapped the president under the guise of combating narco trafficking. That appears to be the pretext they were setting with these charges against President Maduro. And believe it or not, it was William Barr, the current Attorney General, who wrote the legal justification for the invasion of Panama. And now he's the Attorney General working under Trump. You have people like Elliot Abrams and him hanging around. It is worrisome, but I think the one we can take solid, we can be confident in the fact that at the very least, if this was a test balloon that they rolled out against Venezuela, Venezuela won big time. And so the US would be foolish to escalate from here. Venezuela is not going to be a walk in the park like Panama. It's not a country controlled by the
park. It's not going to be a walk in the park like Iraq was.
Or Panama, yeah, or Iraq, but they're going to face a real united military that's ready to fight. And now Russia is saying also that it would help Venezuela in the event of an invasion. So it would be a huge disaster if these neocons got their way.
Which is why it's good to have a multipolar world.
Chinese imperialism, Russian imperialism, yay.
President Chinese imperialism. Thank you so much, Anya, for coming on and breaking all that down for us. It's like a crazy maze.
I know. It's fascinating too.
Well, it's like a movie. It's kind of like a movie. Like, it doesn't sound real. Like a comedy though, not like a thriller.
I almost felt bad for the U.S. citizens when they were being interrogated. One of them actually said that he did it and was only expecting to get paid $50,000 to $100,000.
Do that for 50? Could you imagine like $100,000
for invading a country?
To maybe get captured or killed.
I don't know what was up with those guys, but
anyways, thank you so much for joining us and breaking that down for us. We really appreciate it. So people can follow Red Lines on YouTube.
Yes, on the Grayzone YouTube channel, and yeah, I always post on Twitter. So
on Twitter, Anya Parampil. Hopefully, we can have you back on in the future to dissect whatever next crazy.
It's never a dull moment covering Venezuela, that's for sure.
Thank you so much for coming on, and we'll be back next week.
Sounds good.